The sun beat down on the dusty streets of Redemption, South Dakota, but its heat was nothing compared to the fiery humiliation scorching Beatrice Albright's face. Today was supposed to be her wedding day, a day of white lace and joyous vows. Instead, she stood on the steps of the town hall, a spectacle for the mocking crowd. The townspeople, her neighbors and friends, had gathered not for a celebration, but for a cruel performance orchestrated by her own fiancé, the dashing and arrogant James Miller. James, a man whose charm had won over every heart in Redemption, stepped forward, a sneer playing on his lips. "Folks," he boomed, his voice carrying through the stifling air, "we are gathered here today to witness a union of something I no longer have a stomach for." A wave of laughter rippled through the crowd. Beatrice's heart, already a fractured thing, shattered into a million pieces. Her wedding dress, a beautiful creation she had spent months sewing, felt like a shroud. Its tight corset, meant to cinch her waist, only emphasized what they all saw. A large woman, a bride who didn't fit their picture of perfection. "Beatrice Albright," James continued, his eyes cold and devoid of the affection she once thought was real, "you are a fine woman, but I cannot in good conscience take a wife who takes up more space than the bed itself." More laughter, a few gasps. But no one, not a single soul, stepped forward to defend her. The mayor, a portly man named Mr. Abernathy, who had been a family friend for years, simply looked away. The local reverend, the man who was supposed to marry her, shook his head in disapproval. Beatrice's father, a quiet, reserved man, stood in the back of the crowd, his face a mask of shame and defeat. Her mother, however, held her head high, but the tears in her eyes betrayed her defiance. "This is a joke, a cruel and heartless joke," her mother Eleanor whispered, stepping toward her. "Come now, Beatrice, we can leave." But Beatrice couldn't move. She was rooted to the spot, a monument to their cruelty. James grabbed her arm, his grip surprisingly strong. "This is no joke, Beatrice. We are a town of progress, a town of fine people. We cannot have a bride who is, let's just say she's more than a handful." He shoved her slightly, and a collective gasp went through the crowd as Beatrice stumbled down a step. "I hereby banish you from this town," James announced, his voice filled with a fake solemnity. "Until you can return a woman worthy of a man of my standing, you are no longer welcome in Redemption." He pulled a crumpled piece of paper from his pocket. "This is your new deed, a one-way ticket out of town. The town council, in a moment of mercy, has agreed. You have 24 hours to leave. Don't come back." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. The people of Redemption, once her friends and neighbors, now looked at her with a mix of pity, disgust, and amusement. A few children pointed and giggled. Beatrice's vision blurred with tears, but she refused to let them fall. She would not give them the satisfaction. With a newfound strength, she pulled her arm from James's grasp and stood tall, her shoulders squared. She looked at each person, one by one, engraving their faces into her memory. The baker who had promised her a beautiful cake, the dressmaker who had measured her so many times, the Abernathys who had watched her grow up. All of them complicit in this monstrous act. With a final, silent plea to the heavens, she turned her back on Redemption. The dirt road stretched out before her, a barren path to an unknown future. She had nothing but the clothes on her back, a small bag of coins, and a heart full of a pain so profound it felt physical. The weight of her body, once a source of her insecurity, now felt like an anchor, pulling her down. She walked away from the jeering laughter, from the town she once called home, and into the vast, unforgiving expanse of the American West. She didn't know where she was going or what would become of her, but one thing was certain. She would not return to Redemption as the woman they had banished. She would return someday, a changed woman, and she would make them all regret the day they had turned their backs on her. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting long, lonely shadows on the trail. Beatrice walked on, the silent tears finally falling, a solitary figure against the endless sky. Her journey of exile had just begun. The relentless sun beat down on Beatrice for 3 days, baking the ground and draining the last of her strength. Her beautiful wedding dress was now a tattered, dust-covered mess, her pristine white fabric stained with sweat and grime. The small bag of coins she carried was nearly empty, used on meager rations and a single night's rest in a ramshackle inn. Despair was a heavy cloak, weighing her down more than her own body. She had walked aimlessly, following the dusty trail that led nowhere she knew, driven only by the need to put distance between herself and the town that had so cruelly cast her out. On the 3rd day, as the sun reached its zenith, a dizzying heat haze shimmered over the landscape. Beatrice stumbled, her legs giving out from beneath her. She fell, a clumsy, exhausted heap, her head hitting the hard ground. The world spun, and the sound of buzzing flies became a distant hum. She was done. The vast, empty wilderness of the Dakota Plains was about to claim her. Just as the darkness began to close in, a shadow fell over her. Not the shadow of a cloud, but of a large, imposing man on horseback. He dismounted, his boots kicking up dust as he approached. Beatrice couldn't make out his features. The sunlight was too blinding. All she saw was a silhouette, a figure of strength and stillness. He knelt beside her, and his voice, a low rumble, broke the silence. "You're a long way from home, ma'am. You look like you're about to meet your maker." Beatrice tried to speak, but only a dry rasp escaped her lips. The man, Silas Crow, saw her desperation. He was a man of the land, a rancher who knew the unforgiving nature of the wilderness. He had seen countless fools attempt to cross the plains unprepared, but this woman was different. There was a story in her eyes, a deep-seated pain that went beyond mere thirst. He saw the tattered wedding dress, the expensive lace now soiling the earth, and a flicker of pity, a rare emotion for him, stirred in his chest. Silas reached for his canteen and held it to her lips. The water, cool and life-giving, trickled down her parched throat. She drank greedily, her hands trembling. He offered her a piece of jerky, and she ate it slowly, savoring every tough, salty bite. "What happened to you, ma'am?" he asked, his voice gentle despite his rugged appearance. "This ain't a place for a lady, let alone one in a wedding dress." Beatrice, her strength slowly returning, looked at him. Silas Crow was a man of contradictions. His face was weathered and stern, his hands calloused from years of hard work, but his eyes, a clear, startling blue, held a depth of kindness she hadn't seen in a long time. He was no dandy like James Miller, but a man of substance, a man who looked like he belonged to the earth itself. I was banished," she said, her voice a croak. The shame of it all came rushing back, and a tear finally escaped her eye, tracing a clean line through the dust on her cheek. Silas said nothing for a long moment. He simply stared at her, his gaze unwavering. "Banished from a town. For what reason?" he asked, his tone now laced with a hint of indignation. For being too big," Beatrice said, the words a raw confession. "For being too much. A joke." Silas's jaw tightened. He knew the cruelty of people, the way they could turn on one of their own for no good reason. He had his own reasons for living a solitary life, and they were born of similar betrayals. He saw a kindred spirit in this banished bride. "Get up, ma'am," he said, his voice firm but not unkind. "I'm not leaving you here to die. You can come with me. My ranch is a day's ride from here. You'll be safe there." Beatrice was so desperate, so broken, she didn't hesitate. She struggled to her feet, and Silas, without a word, helped her onto his horse. The journey was long and silent, but she felt a strange sense of peace. This man, a complete stranger, had shown her more compassion in a single hour than her entire town had in her entire life. As they rode, she watched the sun set over the endless plains, the sky a riot of fiery colors. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time since she was cast out, she felt a glimmer of hope. She was no longer alone. She had found a sanctuary, a quiet, strong man who had seen her at her lowest and had still chosen to help. The journey to Silas Crow's ranch was not just a physical one, it was the first step on her long road back to herself. The ride to Silas Crow's ranch was a blur of exhaustion and pain for Beatrice. Her body, unaccustomed to the rigors of horseback riding, ached with every jolt, but she held on, her resolve fueled by the quiet strength of the man who rode with her. The sun dipped below the horizon, and the stars, bright and countless in the unpolluted sky, emerged. Finally, in the distance, a faint light flickered. "That's it," Silas said, his voice a low, reassuring rumble. "The last stand." The name of the ranch, The Last Stand, felt particularly poignant to Beatrice. It felt like her own last stand, her final chance at survival and redemption. As they drew closer, the single light resolved into a small, sturdy cabin, smoke curling from its stone chimney. It was a humble place, a testament to a life lived in isolation and hard work. A few corrals, a small barn, and a well were the only other structures. The ranch was surrounded by nothing but the vast, empty plains, a true sanctuary away from the prying eyes of the world. Silas dismounted and helped Beatrice down. Her legs, stiff and wobbly, nearly gave out. He caught her, his large hands steadying her. "Easy now," he said. He led her into the cabin. The interior was simple but clean and warm. A fire crackled in the hearth, a pot of something savory bubbling over it. A worn leather armchair sat by the fire, a book resting on its arm. The scent of pine and stew filled the air, a comforting aroma she hadn't experienced in days. "Sit," Silas instructed, pointing to the chair. "I'll get you some water and a plate of stew. You look like you haven't eaten in days." Beatrice sank into the chair, the soft leather a welcome relief. She watched as Silas moved about the cabin with an easy, practiced grace. He was a man of order and purpose. He poured a basin of warm water and set it on the floor in front of her. "Wash the dust off," he said, handing her a clean cloth. "I'll fetch you some clean clothes." He returned with a large, simple cotton shirt and a pair of worn canvas trousers. "They'll be too big, but they're clean." Tears welled in Beatrice's eyes. It was the simple kindness of the gestures that undid her. He wasn't looking at her with pity or disgust. He was simply helping, as one human being helps another. She ate the stew he gave her, the warm broth and tender meat, a feast for her starved body. Silas sat across from her, his plate on his lap, watching her with a quiet intensity. He didn't ask questions or make small talk. He simply let her be. When she finished, he took her plate and washed it, then poured her a cup of hot tea. "You can sleep in my bed," he said, gesturing to a small, neatly made cot in the corner. "I'll take the floor." "No," Beatrice said, her voice barely a whisper. "You've done so much, I can't take your bed." Silas gave her a rare, small smile. "It's my ranch, my rules. I'm not a man for debate. Get some rest. We can talk in the morning." He laid out a blanket and a pillow for himself on the floor, and within minutes the only sound was the crackle of the fire and the quiet breathing of two strangers, bound by a shared moment of compassion. Lying on the cot, Beatrice looked around the small cabin. On one wall hung a simple cross, on another a single photograph of a woman with a kind smile. Silas's past was a mystery to her, but his present was clear. He was a good man, a man who lived by a code of honor she had thought was long gone. The weight she had carried for so long, the shame and the pain, began to lift, replaced by a quiet, burgeoning hope. She was safe. She had found a refuge. The Last Stand was not just a name, it was a promise of a new beginning. She closed her eyes, the first peaceful sleep she had had in days finally claiming her. The next morning, Beatrice woke to the scent of coffee and sizzling bacon. The sunlight streamed through the single window of the cabin, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. She found Silas outside, already hard at work mending a fence. He was a man of action, his movements fluid and efficient. He worked tirelessly, his muscular back a testament to a life of physical labor. When he saw her, he simply nodded. "Breakfast is on the stove. Eat up." Beatrice, feeling a bit awkward in the ill-fitting clothes, went inside and found a plate piled high with eggs and bacon. She ate slowly, savoring the simple, wholesome food. When Silas came in for his own plate, the silence between them was not awkward but comfortable. It was a silence born of mutual respect and understanding. After breakfast, Silas turned to her. "We need to talk," he said, his blue eyes meeting hers. "You can't stay in those clothes. I'm heading into town for supplies. I can get you something." Beatrice's heart pounded. "Into town?" she asked, a tremor in her voice. "Which town?" "Fort Union," he said. "It's a small place, about a day's ride from here. Not like the place you came from, I reckon." Beatrice hesitated. The thought of facing another town, of potentially being seen and recognized, filled her with dread. But she also knew she couldn't stay in Silas's clothes forever. "Thank you," she said, her voice small. I'd appreciate that." Silas nodded, his expression unreadable. "Good. I'll be back by tomorrow evening." He saddled his horse and was gone, leaving Beatrice alone at the last stand. The hours stretched before her, an eternity of solitude. But it was a peaceful solitude, a stark contrast to the loneliness she had felt in Redemption. She explored the small ranch, marveling at its self-sufficiency. The well provided fresh water, a small garden patch held the promise of vegetables, and the corrals housed a few strong, healthy horses. She felt an urge to make herself useful. She started by sweeping the cabin, then washing the dishes. She even ventured outside and began to pull weeds from the garden. The work was simple and therapeutic. It gave her a sense of purpose, a feeling she hadn't had in a long time. That evening, as the sun set, Beatrice stood by the cabin, watching the landscape change from a dusty brown to a fiery orange and purple. The vastness of the plains, which had once felt so threatening, now felt like a promise of freedom. She thought of Redemption, of the people who had hurt her, and for the first time she felt a pang of something other than pain. She felt anger, a cold, hard anger that she hadn't known she was capable of. They had tried to break her, but they hadn't succeeded. They had only given her a new beginning. She was still thinking about this newfound resolve when Silas returned, his horse laden with supplies. He handed her a wrapped package. "I got you a few things, a dress, some undergarments, and a pair of boots." Beatrice unwrapped the package, her hands trembling. The dress was a simple, sturdy calico, a deep, beautiful blue. It wasn't a fancy dress, but it was perfect. The boots were a practical, comfortable leather. They were all new, a testament to his generosity. "Thank you, Silas," she said, her voice thick with emotion. You didn't have to do this." "Everyone needs clothes," he said, his tone curt, as if embarrassed by her gratitude. He went about his business, unloading the supplies, but Beatrice saw the small, pleased curve of his lips. He was a man who didn't deal in empty words, but in meaningful actions. As the days turned into weeks, a quiet routine settled between them. Beatrice took on the domestic chores, cooking, cleaning, and tending to the garden. Silas worked the land, mending fences, training horses, and preparing for the coming winter. They talked little, but their silent communication was a language of its own. She learned to read his moods by the set of his jaw, the slight tension in his shoulders. He learned to read hers by the way she hummed a song while cooking, or the way she would stare out at the horizon, lost in thought. They were two broken people, strangers who had found a home in each other's company. The unspoken bond that had formed between them was stronger than any vow. It was a bond of trust, of quiet respect, and of a shared understanding that some wounds, no matter how deep, can be healed by the simple presence of another human being. The last stand was no longer just a ranch. It was a home. The weeks turned into months, and the seasons began to change. The scorching heat of summer gave way to the crisp, cool air of autumn. The quiet life at the Last Stand Ranch, once a temporary refuge, had become Beatrice's new reality. She had found her rhythm, a routine that gave her purpose, and a sense of self-worth she had long forgotten. Under Silas's patient and silent guidance, Beatrice began to change. It was not a magical, overnight transformation, but a slow, steady process. The physical labor of ranch life, from hauling buckets of water from the well to tending the small garden and even helping with the lighter chores in the barn, began to take its toll on her body in the best possible way. The weight she had carried for so long, the very thing that had been the subject of her public humiliation, began to melt away. Her face, once round and soft, became more defined, her cheeks acquiring a healthy glow from the fresh air and sunshine. Her body, once cumbersome, was now leaner, stronger, and more capable. The change wasn't just physical. The time she spent with Silas, in the quiet solitude of the plains, allowed her to heal emotionally. He never brought up her past, never mentioned redemption or the cruel joke that had exiled her. He simply treated her as a capable, equal partner. His respect, a simple, unwavering thing, was a balm for her soul. She learned to trust him, to lean on him, not just for physical support, but for emotional stability. One cool autumn morning, Silas found her at the well, struggling with a heavy bucket of water. He walked over and, without a word, took the rope from her and hauled the bucket up with effortless strength. "You're getting stronger," he said, his voice a low, gravelly sound. Beatrice looked at him, surprised by the direct compliment. "I am," she said, a small, proud smile on her face. "I'm not the same person I was." "No," Silas agreed, his eyes holding a depth of understanding. "You're not." He paused, looking at her, and for a fleeting moment she saw something more than friendship in his gaze, a quiet admiration. "You've always been strong. You just never had a reason to show it. Until now." The silence that followed was charged with unspoken emotion. They were no longer just two people sharing a cabin. They were a team, a quiet partnership forged in the crucible of their shared isolation. They found companionship in the simple tasks of daily life. He would read to her by the fire on cold nights, his deep voice a comforting presence. She would mend his clothes and cook his meals, finding a quiet satisfaction in caring for the man who had so selflessly cared for her. Beatrice's confidence grew with each passing day. She learned to ride a horse, to shoot a rifle, and to track small game. Silas taught her, his lessons brief but effective. "Don't aim with your eyes," he told her, his hand guiding hers as she held a rifle. "Aim with your heart. Know what you're fighting for." His words resonated deeply. She was no longer just fighting for survival. She was fighting for herself. The woman who had been banished for her size was gone, replaced by a resilient, capable woman who was learning to navigate the world on her own terms. The thought of redemption, once a source of pain and shame, now filled her with a steely resolve. She would return, someday, not to seek vengeance, but to show them what they had so foolishly cast aside. The change was not a complete victory. There were still moments of doubt, flashes of her old insecurities, but when those moments came, Silas was always there, a quiet presence, a steady hand on her shoulder, a look of unwavering belief in his clear blue eyes. He was her anchor, the one person who saw her not for who she was, but for who she could become. The journey of transformation was long and arduous, but with Silas by her side, Beatrice knew she would reach her destination. Her last stand was no longer just a ranch, it was the beginning of her new life. As the cold winds of winter began to blow across the plains, the solitude of the Last Stand Ranch was broken. A lone figure on horseback appeared on the horizon, a man with a tattered coat and a tired, defeated slump to his shoulders. He was a drifter, a former lawman named Elias Grant, who had been disgraced and run out of a town for refusing to follow a corrupt sheriff's orders. He was hungry, cold, and a day away from giving up. Silas, a man who understood the weight of a broken past, offered him a place at the fire, a hot meal, and a cot in the barn. Elias, grateful and humble, accepted. The next week a family arrived, a widowed mother, Sarah, and her 2 young children, who had lost their farm to predatory land speculators. They were desperate and without hope. Again, Silas offered a place, a shelter from the coming storm. The Last Stand Ranch, once a solitary sanctuary, was slowly becoming a haven for the cast-offs of the West. It was an unofficial community of exiles, a collection of broken people who had been rejected by society for one reason or another. There was the blacksmith who had lost his shop due to a rigged lottery, the former schoolteacher who had been ostracized for teaching African-American children, and a handful of others with similar stories of betrayal and loss. They were a motley crew, but they were bound by a shared understanding of human cruelty. Beatrice, who had been an exile herself, took on the role of den mother. She had always been a caring, nurturing person, and now she had an outlet for that compassion. She organized the group, assigning chores, rationing food, and listening to their stories. She found a deep sense of purpose in helping these people, in creating a small, safe world for them in the middle of nowhere. Her transformation from a humiliated bride to a compassionate leader was complete. Silas, the quiet, solitary rancher, watched her with a quiet satisfaction. He had always been a man of few words, but he spoke volumes in his actions. He provided for them all, sharing his food, his resources, and his knowledge. He taught the men how to hunt and fish, how to mend fences, and how to work the land. He was their rock, their silent protector. The ranch flourished under their combined efforts. The small garden was expanded, and a larger barn was built. The men worked together, their shared labor creating a sense of camaraderie and purpose. The women, led by Beatrice, worked together to cook, clean, and care for the children. They were a family, not by blood, but by choice. One evening, as they all sat around a large fire sharing stories and laughter, Elias Grant, the former lawman, turned to Beatrice. "You know," he said, his eyes a mix of gratitude and respect, "you saved us, Beatrice, all of us. You gave us a reason to keep going." Beatrice's heart swelled with a warmth she hadn't felt in a long time. "It was Silas who saved us all," she said, looking at the silent man sitting across from the fire, his face illuminated by the dancing flames. Silas, who had been listening in silence, simply grunted. "Everyone deserves a second chance," he said, his gaze fixed on the fire. "No one should be left out to die for being different." He looked at Beatrice then, a look that conveyed a world of emotion. "You were just the first." The group nodded in agreement. They were all different. They were all broken. But here, in this remote corner of the world, they were not judged. They were simply accepted. The Last Stand Ranch had become more than a sanctuary. It had become a symbol of hope, a small community of outcasts, bound by their shared experiences, who had found a home in the unlikeliest of places. As the snow began to fall, blanketing the plains in a serene white, the community at the Last Stand Ranch settled into the quiet rhythm of winter. The days were spent on indoor chores, mending clothes, whittling wood, and telling stories. The nights were filled with the warmth of the fire and the simple pleasure of companionship. For the first time in a long time, Beatrice felt truly happy. She had a purpose, a home, and a found family. Most importantly, she had Silas. Their relationship had deepened from one of a protector and the protected to something more. There was an easy comfort between them, an intimacy of shared glances and quiet understandings. The physical attraction, which had been a quiet undercurrent, was now a tangible thing. They were two people who had found solace in each other's pain and had built a life on the foundation of mutual respect. One evening, as they sat by the fire, Silas finally broke his silence about his own past. "My wife," he began, his voice a low, somber tone. "She was a good woman, the kindest soul you'd ever meet. She had a sickness, one that no one understood. The town, they saw it as a weakness, a flaw. They said she was cursed. They called her a witch. They ran her out of town, and when I refused to go with them, they burned our home. Beatrice's heart ached for him. She reached out and took his hand, her fingers intertwining with his calloused ones. His pain was a tangible thing, a ghost that haunted his every move. "I'm so sorry, Silas," she whispered. He squeezed her hand. "The town was Redemption," he said, the name a bitter taste on his tongue. "The mayor, a man named Abernathy, was the one who led the charge. He was a coward. He couldn't stand to see anything he couldn't control. And he couldn't control her." He looked at Beatrice, his eyes filled with a raw, powerful emotion. "When I saw you, Beatrice, standing there in that dress, I saw her, a good woman, punished for nothing. The revelation was a shock. Redemption. The same town that had so cruelly cast her out had also destroyed the life of the man who had saved her. It was a twisted, cruel coincidence, a cosmic joke. The weight of this new knowledge settled on Beatrice. Their connection, their shared history of betrayal at the hands of the same people, was even deeper than she had thought. "Abernathy," she said, her voice filled with a cold, hard resolve. "He was there, Silas. He was there on the steps of the town hall. He watched them humiliate me, and he did nothing. He stood by as James Miller, my own fiancé, led the mob." Silas's jaw tightened, a muscle in his cheek twitching. "James Miller," he said, the name a low growl. "I'll remember that name." The rest of the night was filled with a new kind of silence. The comfortable silence of companionship was replaced by a tense, brooding quiet. The easy happiness of their lives was now tinged with the dark shadows of their past. They were no longer just two people living in peace. They were two people with a shared history of betrayal and a common enemy. The quiet, peaceful sanctuary of the Last Stand Ranch was suddenly an armed fortress, a place where they would not just survive, but where they would prepare. Beatrice knew in that moment that their story was far from over. Redemption, the town that had wronged them both, was still out there, its people still living in their ignorance and cruelty. The time would come when they would have to face it, to reclaim what was taken from them. But for now, they would simply wait, and they would get stronger. They would train. They would prepare. They would become the storm that redemption so justly deserved. The peaceful life was a preparation, a quiet gathering of strength before the inevitable reckoning. The long winter gave way to a new spring, and with it came a sense of renewed purpose. Beatrice and Silas had spent the past few months preparing, not just for the coming year, but for a future that would lead them back to redemption. Beatrice, now a woman of strength and purpose, had not only shed her former body, but also the emotional weight of her past. Her confidence was no longer a quiet internal thing. It was a visible, tangible force. She was now a skilled rider and an excellent shot, a woman who could hold her own in the unforgiving landscape of the West. Silas, her constant companion and teacher, had molded her into a warrior, not of violence but of resilience. He taught her how to survive, to be self-sufficient, and to trust her own judgment. But most importantly, he had taught her to trust him. Their relationship had blossomed into something beautiful and profound. The quiet companionship had deepened into a fierce, unspoken love. They were two broken people who had found solace in each other's arms, two souls who had built a home out of nothing but their shared pain and unwavering trust. The physical closeness was a natural extension of their emotional bond. One moonlit night, as they sat by the fire, Silas reached out and took her hand. "I love you, Beatrice," he said, the words a shock of raw, honest emotion in the quiet air. Beatrice's heart leaped in her chest. She had longed to hear those words, but she never expected them. "I love you too, Silas," she said, her voice thick with emotion. They sealed the words with a kiss, a gentle, tender affirmation of their shared journey. Their love was not a grand, dramatic romance, but a quiet, steady flame that burned brightly in the darkness of their past. And so, they were married. Not in a grand church with a mocking crowd, but in the quiet solitude of the plains, with only the stars as their witnesses. Elias Grant, their first exile, officiated the simple ceremony. It was a union of two souls, bound by love and a shared resolve. The next morning, as the sun rose over the horizon, Silas turned to Beatrice. "It's time," he said, his blue eyes holding a steely determination. "We go back." Beatrice's heart pounded with a mix of fear and excitement. The thought of returning to redemption was terrifying, but she knew it was necessary. She was no longer a victim. She was a woman on a mission. "I'm ready," she said, her voice firm. They gathered their resources and said goodbye to their found family. The exiles, a collection of strong, resilient people, watched them leave with a mix of pride and trepidation. "Bring that town to its knees, Silas," Elias Grant said, a grim smile on his face. "It's what they deserve." Silas and Beatrice rode side by side, their horses a mirror image of their shared purpose. They rode for a day and a night, their journey filled with a silent, simmering anticipation. They talked of their plans, of what they would do, of the people they would face. Beatrice no longer felt like the clumsy, overweight woman who had been banished. She felt like a warrior, a bride of a new kind, one who had been forged in the crucible of pain and had emerged stronger for it. As they rode into the outskirts of redemption, the town looked exactly as she remembered it. A dusty, unkempt collection of buildings, its people going about their lives, unaware of the reckoning that was about to arrive. The sun was high in the sky, a cruel echo of the day she had been cast out. But this time she was not alone. She was with the man who had saved her, the man who had loved her, the man who was now her husband. The woman they had banished was back, and she was ready to face them all. The dust-covered streets of redemption felt both familiar and alien to Beatrice. The town, once the site of her greatest humiliation, now seemed small and insignificant. The people, who had once been a monolithic, mocking crowd, were now just individuals, their faces etched with the daily struggles of life. She and Silas rode their horses slowly, their presence drawing curious, then wary, glances from the townspeople. No one recognized her, at least not yet. They dismounted in front of the town hall, the very place where her life had been so publicly dismantled. A few people stopped to stare, their eyes assessing the two strong, purposeful figures. Silas's presence was a statement in itself. He was a man who commanded respect, his quiet strength a palpable force. As they entered the town hall, the mayor, Mr. Abernathy, looked up from his desk. He was a portly, pompous man, and the lines of stress on his face suggested that the town's fortunes had not improved since Beatrice's exile. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice a condescending drawl. He glanced at Beatrice, a fleeting look of confusion on his face, but he didn't recognize her. "Yes, Mr. Abernathy," Silas said, his voice a low, commanding rumble. "We're here to talk about the town's finances. We understand you're in a bit of trouble." Abernathy's eyes narrowed. "And who are you, a stranger, to be concerned with our business?" "My name is Silas Crow," he said, his gaze unwavering, "and this is my wife, Beatrice." The name hung in the air like a sudden clap of thunder. Abernathy's face, which had been a mask of smug authority, paled. His eyes darted to Beatrice, and for a moment the cruel, arrogant man she remembered was replaced by a terrified, guilt-ridden coward. "Beatrice," he whispered, his voice a disbelieving croak. "No, that's not possible. The other one, she was bigger." Beatrice's lips curled into a cold, triumphant smile. "She was," she said, her voice clear and strong, a world away from the terrified whisper she had used on the day of her banishment. "But she's not anymore. I came back, Mr. Abernathy, just as I promised." Abernathy sputtered, his hands trembling. You can't be here. You were banished. It's illegal." "The town council banished me," Beatrice said, her eyes fixed on his. "And I believe as your wife I'll have a say in that." Abernathy's eyes widened in horror. "Wife? You're married to him." "He's not just a man, Mr. Abernathy," Silas said, his voice a sharp, cutting edge. He's a man of means, a man who owns a large, successful ranch, and a man who has a vested interest in the future of this town." The mayor collapsed into his chair, a defeated man. The joke had turned on him. The humiliated bride, the object of their public ridicule, had returned a changed woman, stronger, more beautiful, and now, with the support of a powerful man. The tables had turned, and the reckoning had just begun. The people of Redemption, who had once celebrated her banishment, were about to face the consequences of their actions. The first domino had fallen, and the rest were sure to follow. The news of Beatrice's return and her marriage to the influential Silas Crowe spread through Redemption like a wildfire. Whispers turned to stares, and stares turned to panicked murmurs. The people who had laughed at her, who had turned their backs on her, now watched her with a mixture of disbelief and fear. She was no longer a joke, she was a reckoning. James Miller, the arrogant fiancé who had orchestrated her humiliation, was the first to face her. He found her in front of the general store, her horse tied to the post. He approached her, a sneer still on his face, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of unease. "Beatrice," he said, his voice a smooth pretense of familiarity. "You've changed. I knew you could do it. I was just giving you a little motivation." Beatrice turned to him, her gaze as cold and unforgiving as the Dakota wind. "Motivation?" she scoffed. "You didn't give me motivation, James. You gave me a death sentence. You and this whole town. But I survived." She looked him up and down, her eyes lingering on his expensive, well-tailored clothes. "And what did you get for it? A town on the brink of ruin, a mayor who's a coward, and a future that's slipping through your fingers." James's face reddened. "I'm a respected man in this town, Beatrice, a man of standing. You should be grateful I didn't marry you." "Grateful?" Silas said, his voice a low growl from behind her. He had been standing in the shadows, a silent, menacing presence. "You wouldn't know gratitude if it hit you in the face, Miller. The only thing you've ever known is cruelty." James flinched, his bravado crumbling under Silas's unwavering gaze. He was a man of words and empty gestures, and Silas was a man of action and raw power. "This isn't over," James muttered, turning and walking away, his shoulders slumped in defeat. The town, however, was far from defeated. A group of the town's prominent citizens, the baker, the dressmaker, the town council members, gathered in the street, their faces a mix of defiance and trepidation. They were the ones who had signed her banishment order. They were the ones who had stood by and watched her fall. Beatrice, her voice carrying through the dusty street, addressed them all. "I've returned to Redemption not for vengeance, but for justice," she said, her voice clear and strong. "You all stood by as I was humiliated. You all signed the paper that sent me to my death, but I was saved, and I have returned to save this town from the very people who have ruined it. Mr. Abernathy, your mayor, is a corrupt man. He has been taking money from a railroad company that plans to run its tracks straight through the heart of our community, tearing down homes and businesses and leaving nothing but dust in its wake." A murmur of shock rippled through the crowd. They had heard rumors, but they had never believed them. Abernathy, their esteemed mayor, a thief. It was an unthinkable betrayal. "We have proof," Silas said, stepping forward, his hands holding a collection of documents. "Signed deeds, receipts, ledgers, all of them detailing the kickbacks and bribes Abernathy has been taking from the Golden West Railroad. He was planning to sell you all out." The townspeople's faces turned from shock to anger. A low, menacing hum filled the air as they began to close in on the town hall, their collective rage a palpable force. The mayor, peering through the window, saw the approaching mob and his face went white. The reckoning was not just for Beatrice, it was for the entire town. They were about to learn that their cruelty had come with a price, and that the woman they had banished was their only hope for salvation. The angry mob stormed the town hall, their shouts of "traitor" and "thief" echoing through the building. Mayor Abernathy, A man who had always relied on his position to intimidate others was now a terrified, cowering figure. He was trapped, cornered, by the very people he had betrayed. Beatrice and Silas watched from a distance as the townspeople, led by a newly emboldened Elias Grant, who had ridden in with a few others from the ranch, confronted the mayor. They had found the Golden West Railroad's contracts, the forged deeds, and the ledgers that proved his corruption. It was a humiliating public reckoning, a mirror image of the one Beatrice had faced on the same steps. Abernathy, his hands raised in surrender, stammered out excuses, his voice a whimper. I was just looking out for the town. The railroad promised progress, a new future." "A new future for your pockets, you mean?" Elias said, his eyes filled with a cold, righteous fury. "You sold us out, Abernathy. You sold us out to a company that would have bulldozed our homes and left us for dead." The crowd roared in agreement, their anger a fiery inferno. They dragged the mayor from his office, his protests drowned out by their furious shouts. The town, once a place of self-righteous judgment, was now a place of unified rage against the man who had brought them to the brink of ruin. Later that evening, as the dust began to settle, a different kind of confrontation took place. The town council, the same men who had signed her banishment order, approached Beatrice and Silas. They were humbled, their arrogance replaced by shame and desperation. "We were wrong, Beatrice," one of them said, his voice thick with regret. "We were so wrong. We ask for your forgiveness." Beatrice looked at them, her face a mask of quiet resolve. "Forgiveness is not for me to give," she said. "It's for you to earn. You stood by and watched a man I loved burn down my home, Mr. Abernathy. You stood by and watched a good woman suffer, and you allowed my wife to be cast out." Abernathy, who had been taken to the town jail, watched from a distance as the townspeople, now united in their regret, looked at Beatrice not with pity or disgust, but with a new sense of respect. They had seen her strength, her resilience, and her ability to fight for justice. She was no longer an outcast. She was their leader. The town, however, was still in peril. The Golden West Railroad, a powerful and ruthless company, was not a force to be trifled with. They had already invested in the land, and they would not back down without a fight. The contracts were a problem, but the real issue was the town's debt. Abernathy had embezzled so much that the town was on the verge of bankruptcy. "The railroad company won't care about a change in leadership," Silas said, his voice grave. "They'll just find a new person to bribe. We need to do something more." "We'll buy it," Beatrice said, her voice firm. Silas looked at her, his eyebrows raised. "Buy what?" "The town's debt," she said, her eyes fixed on the ledger on the mayor's desk. "We'll use the money from our ranch. We'll pay off the town's debt. And in exchange, they will vote for me to be the new mayor. Then we can use our legal counsel to expose the railroad's contracts for what they are, fraudulent. We can stop them." Silas's lips curled into a rare smile. It was a daring plan, a move that would risk their entire fortune, but it was the only way. "It's a huge gamble, Beatrice," he said. "I'm not afraid of gambles," she said, looking out at the townspeople who had once been her enemies. "I've learned that the biggest risks are the ones we don't take." The town, humbled and grateful, agreed to the plan. They had no other choice. They had been wrong, and now they had to trust the woman they had once cast out to save them from themselves. The long road to redemption had just begun. The following week, in a solemn ceremony held on the same steps where she had been humiliated, Beatrice was sworn in as the new mayor of redemption. The town council, the same people who had signed her banishment order, now stood beside her, their faces etched with a profound sense of humility. Her mother, Eleanor, stood in the crowd, her eyes filled with tears of pride and vindication. Beatrice wore a simple, elegant blue dress, a stark contrast to the white wedding gown she had worn on that fateful day. She was no longer just Beatrice Albright. She was Beatrice Crowe, the mayor of redemption. The crowd, now her constituents, watched her with a newfound respect. They had seen her strength, her intelligence, and her unwavering sense of justice. She was a different woman, one who had been forged in the crucible of their cruelty and had emerged stronger for it. In her inaugural speech, Beatrice addressed the townspeople. She didn't speak of forgiveness or forgetfulness. She spoke of rebuilding, of working together, and of the long road ahead. "We have a lot of work to do," she said, her voice clear and strong. "We have to rebuild this town, not just physically, but morally. We have to become a community that doesn't cast out its own, but one that welcomes and supports them." She turned to Silas, her husband, her partner in this long journey. He stood behind her, a silent, powerful presence. He was not the mayor, but everyone in town knew who held the real power. He was the one who had saved her, the one who had given her the strength to return. He was the force behind the throne, the silent architect of their redemption. The first order of business was to deal with the Golden West Railroad. Beatrice, using her new authority as mayor and with Silas's legal help, sent a message to the company's regional office. She declared their contracts null and void, citing the fraudulent nature of their acquisition. The company, a ruthless corporation with a team of lawyers, scoffed at the small-town mayor. They sent a representative, a slick, condescending man in a fine suit, to deal with the problem. The representative, a man named Sterling, arrived in redemption with an air of superiority. He laughed at the idea of a woman running a town, let alone challenging a powerful railroad company. He saw Beatrice as a simpleton, a small-town figurehead who would crumble under pressure. He was about to learn that he was very, very wrong. Beatrice met him in her office, with Silas and Elias Grant by her side. She was no longer the soft, insecure woman she had been. She was a poised, intelligent woman who was more than a match for him. She laid out the fraudulent documents, the ledgers that proved the bribery, and the town's deed, now legally held by her and Silas. "Your contracts are worthless, Mr. Sterling," she said, her voice firm. "And any attempt to trespass on this town's land will be met with the full force of the law." Sterling scoffed. "And what law would that be? A town with no police force? A town on the brink of bankruptcy?" "The law of a town that owes no debt to anyone," Silas said, stepping forward, "and the law of a community that has found its own strength. You and your railroad are no longer welcome here, Mr. Sterling. The only thing you'll find here is a unified people who are no longer afraid." Sterling, realizing he had underestimated them, left redemption with a newfound respect and a sense of defeat. The railroad, a massive and powerful entity, was finally on the run. The mayor's wife, the woman they had laughed at, had just done the impossible. The town, in a single day, had been saved. With the Golden West Railroad's threat neutralized, redemption began the long process of rebuilding. Beatrice, as mayor, initiated a series of projects to restore the town to its former glory. She used the money from her and Silas's ranch to rebuild the town hall, to repair the roads, and to establish a new, fair system of governance. Silas, a man of action and integrity, oversaw the projects, his quiet strength a constant, reassuring presence. The townspeople, humbled by their past mistakes, worked together, a sense of community and purpose replacing the bitterness and self-righteousness that had once defined them. They were no longer the town that had banished the obese bride. They were the town that had been saved by the mayor's wife. Their shame was a powerful motivator, and they worked tirelessly to atone for their past. Beatrice, once the victim of their cruelty, was now a beloved and respected leader. She was a fair and just mayor, a woman who listened to the needs of her people and worked to solve their problems. She was more than a political figurehead. She was a symbol of hope and second chances. She had taken their betrayal and had used it to forge a new future for them all. James Miller, her former fiancé, found himself an outcast in the very town he had once ruled. His charm and good looks were no longer enough to mask his cruelty. The townspeople, who had once admired him, now saw him for what he was, a coward who had sold his soul for a laugh. He tried to leave, but the town's shame followed him everywhere. He was a man with no future, a symbol of a past that the town was desperate to forget. The Last Stand Ranch, the sanctuary that had saved Beatrice, continued to thrive. It became a model for the new redemption, a place where people were judged not by their past, but by their character. The community of exiles, the people who had found a home with Silas and Beatrice, became an integral part of the new town, their skills and their resilience a valuable asset. Elias Grant, the former lawman, became the new sheriff of redemption, a man of integrity who was committed to justice. One evening, as Beatrice and Silas sat on the porch of the mayor's office, watching the sunset over the newly repaired town, she turned to him. "We did it," she said, her voice filled with a quiet satisfaction. "We saved them." Silas, his arm around her, simply nodded. "We did," he said, "but the real victory wasn't in saving the town. It was in saving ourselves." Beatrice leaned her head on his shoulder, a profound sense of peace settling over her. She was no longer a victim, no longer a refugee. She was a woman who had found her strength, a woman who had found love, and a woman who had found a purpose far greater than herself. The town of redemption, once a symbol of her pain, was now a symbol of her triumph. The final chapter of her long journey had been written, and it was a happy one. With the town's financial and political future secured, Beatrice, as the new mayor, turned her attention to the deeper wounds of the community. She knew that simply paying off a debt and rebuilding a few buildings wouldn't be enough. The town needed to heal from the inside out, and that required confronting the very prejudice and cruelty that had led to her banishment. Beatrice called a town meeting. The entire community gathered in the town hall, the air thick with anticipation. She stood on the stage, Silas by her side, her presence a powerful reminder of how much had changed. "I want to talk about forgiveness," she began, her voice steady and clear. "Not just my forgiveness of you, but your forgiveness of each other. This town has been divided by pride and prejudice for too long. We have cast out our own, and we have allowed hatred to fester. This must stop." She spoke of the exiles who had found a home at the Last Stand Ranch, the very people who were now helping to rebuild redemption. She told their stories. Elias, the lawman who had been disgraced. Sarah, the widow who had lost her farm. The blacksmith who had been cheated out of his business. "These are good people," she said, her voice ringing with conviction. "They are people who have been wronged, just as I was. They are people who have found a home here, and they are now our neighbors, our friends, and our family. They are the true reflection of what this town can be." The townspeople listened, their faces a mix of shame and understanding. They had seen the kindness of these new residents, their hard work, and their dedication to the community. They had seen how they had helped rebuild the town, how they had helped bring back a sense of purpose and hope. For the first time, they saw the full extent of their past cruelty. Beatrice did not demand their forgiveness. She simply offered them a choice. "We can continue to be a town of judgment and exclusion, or we can become a town of compassion and acceptance," she said. "The choice is yours." The townspeople did not need to be told twice. They went to the exiles, offering their apologies and their friendship. The former residents of the Last Stand Ranch were hesitant at first, but they saw the genuine regret in the townspeople's eyes. A slow, tentative reconciliation began, a process of healing that was as difficult as it was necessary. The town, once defined by its cruelty, was now defined by its compassion. The baker who had laughed at Beatrice now baked bread for the formerly disgraced blacksmith. The dressmaker who had judged her now sewed a dress for Sarah, the widow. The community, once fragmented, was now unified by their shared journey of redemption. Beatrice and Silas watched it all with quiet satisfaction. They had not just saved a town, they had saved a community. They had shown them that the past does not have to define the future, and that the greatest act of courage is not to fight an enemy, but to forgive and accept a neighbor. The town of redemption was finally living up to its name. Years passed, and the town of Redemption blossomed under Beatrice's leadership. It became a beacon of hope in the West, a town known not for its past cruelty, but for its unwavering sense of community and justice. The story of the mayor's wife, the woman who had been banished for her size and returned to save her town, became a legend, a whispered tale of redemption and triumph. Beatrice, now a wise and respected leader, was no longer a victim. She was a symbol of resilience, a testament to the fact that true strength is not found in a person's size, but in their character. She was not just a mayor, she was a mother, a wife, and a friend. She and Silas had built a life together, a beautiful, simple life filled with love and purpose. They had a son, a quiet, strong boy with his father's eyes and his mother's sense of justice. The last stand. Ranch continued to thrive, but it was no longer just a sanctuary for exiles. It was a home for all, a place where people from all walks of life could find a second chance. The community of exiles, once a collection of broken people, had become the town's backbone, their stories a powerful reminder of the long road they had all traveled. One afternoon, as Beatrice and Silas sat on the porch of their home, watching their son play in the yard, she turned to him. "Do you ever think about them, Silas?" she asked, her voice soft. "James Miller, Mr. Abernathy? The people who hurt us?" Silas shook his head. "They're just shadows now, Beatrice, ghosts of a past that no longer exists. They're not a part of our story anymore. Our story is here. It's in this town, in this home, in our son." Beatrice smiled, a profound sense of peace settling over her. She knew he was right. The past was a memory, a scar that had healed. The future, however, was a blank page, waiting to be written. She was no longer the humiliated bride. She was the mayor's wife. She was Beatrice Crowe, a woman who had faced her demons and had emerged victorious. Her legacy was not one of vengeance, but one of love, compassion, and the unwavering belief that everyone deserves a second chance. And so, the story of the banished bride came to a close. It was a story not of a fairy tale ending, but of a real, authentic, and hard-earned victory. It was a story of a woman who had found her strength, a man who had found his purpose, and a town that had found its redemption. The sun set over the plains, casting a golden hue over the town of Redemption. It was a town that had learned its lesson, a town that was finally, truly living up to its name.